Fear is power. Weakness is death. That's not just a bold title. It's a hard truth, one that history has proven again and again. The people who rise in this world, the ones who lead, who dominate, who survive, aren't always the kindest. They're not always the most intelligent or most virtuous. But they all share one thing, an understanding of fear. How to use it, how to command it, and how to make sure others feel it more than they do. Fear is older than law, older than religion, older than civilization itself. It's a natural force baked into our instincts. And whether we're ready to admit it or not, fear shapes how people behave, how power moves, and how the world works. Now, we're often told that the best leaders are loved, that kindness builds loyalty, that empathy creates strength, and sure, love, when it works, can unite people. But love is fragile, love can fade, love is voluntary. Fear isn't. Fear commands attention. Fear demands caution. Fear doesn't ask for permission, it imposes itself. Niccolo Machiavelli, one of the most honest minds in political philosophy, said it clearly. It is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Not because fear is noble, but because fear is reliable. It holds when love breaks. It protects when admiration fades. And more than anything, it keeps enemies from getting too close. Throughout history, rulers who understood fear survived longer. Empires that mastered it lasted centuries. And even today, behind polished speeches and perfect smiles, you'll still find it, quiet, hidden, but present. The fear of losing control, the fear of appearing weak. Because weakness is an invitation. It sends a signal, a scent in the air, and predators pick up on it fast. Whether it's in politics, war, business, or even in everyday life, if you seem weak, people don't feel sorry for you. They circle you, they test you, and eventually, they replace you. Weakness doesn't always kill you with violence. Sometimes it kills you with silence. People stop listening, stop caring. You become irrelevant, forgotten. And in a world driven by power and presence, that might be worse than death. This isn't about cruelty, it's not about becoming a monster. It's about survival. It's about knowing what really keeps people in power, what really makes others respect you, and what really holds a system, any system, together. Over the next few sections, we're going to explore this in detail. We'll look at how fear has been used as a tool, not just by tyrants, but by institutions, by movements, and even by everyday people. We'll break down what weakness really means, and how it's punished by the world, whether we like it or not. And we'll examine the balance, how fear can be used with precision, without slipping into chaos. We'll study real moments from history. We'll pull ideas from psychology and philosophy, and we'll confront some uncomfortable truths about the cost of being too kind, too soft, or too trusting in a world that doesn't always reward those things. This isn't a message of despair, it's a message of clarity, because fear, when used wisely, becomes strength, and weakness, when ignored, becomes a slow form of death. That's the world we live in. It always has been. Fear isn't just an emotion, it's a tool, and like any powerful tool, it can be used to build or to destroy. But either way, it gets results. If you want to understand how fear works in power, there's one name you can't ignore: Machiavelli. He didn't invent fear, but he understood it better than most. In his book, The Prince, he laid it out plainly. If a leader has to choose between being loved or feared, he should always choose fear. Why? Because love depends on loyalty, on goodwill, on people choosing to stand with you. But fear forces people to think twice before crossing you. Fear doesn't care how someone feels. It controls how they act. Machiavelli wasn't being cruel. He was being realistic. He lived in a time of betrayal, war, and shifting alliances. He saw what happened to rulers who were too soft. They were overthrown, exiled, or killed. The ones who lasted weren't necessarily kind. They were cunning, and they knew how to make fear work in their favor. And it's not just theory. History is full of examples. Look at Stalin, one of the most feared leaders of the 20th century. He didn't just lead through policies, he ruled through terror. His secret police could make anyone disappear. People were scared to even speak his name in private. But that fear, it kept the population under control for decades. It created silence, obedience, and order, no matter how brutal the cost. Or go further back, to ancient Rome. When they crucified people, it wasn't just punishment. It was a message. It was fear turned into theatre. You saw the bodies on the road, and you knew what would happen if you stepped out of line. The goal wasn't just justice, it was control. Even in modern times, fear plays a major role. Think about shock and awe in military strategy. The point isn't just to win, it's to overwhelm. To make the enemy so afraid, so psychologically crushed, that they stop resisting altogether. That's not just firepower, it's fear as a weapon. But this goes deeper than politics or war. Fear works because of how we're wired. It speaks directly to the oldest part of our brain, the part that doesn't reason, doesn't debate, doesn't negotiate, it just reacts. When you're afraid, your body changes, your heart races, your focus sharpens, you freeze or you flee. That response is ancient and it's powerful, and those who understand it can shape entire systems around it. Look at what happened in the Stanford prison experiment. A group of volunteers were put into a fake prison, some as guards, others as prisoners. Within days, the guards, who had no real power at the start, began to use fear to dominate. They yelled, they punished, they humiliated. Why? Because the moment fear entered the room, it changed the rules. It gave them control. Even though it was just a simulation, people broke down under the pressure. That's the raw force of fear. It turns ordinary people into tyrants. And it turns strong minds into submissive ones. So how do people in power use fear? It starts with uncertainty. If people don't know what you'll do next, they become cautious. If they're afraid of disappointing you, or crossing a line they can't see, they'll play it safe. That's control. Then comes consequence. Not just punishment, but public punishment. Letting others see what happens when someone disrespects you, when someone tries to cheat you or betray you. That's how fear becomes a lesson for everyone else. And finally, there's reputation. If people believe you don't tolerate disrespect, if they believe you'll strike back harder than you were hit, they think twice. Even if you never have to act. Sometimes fear works best when it's silent. This isn't about becoming violent, it's about understanding perception. Power isn't just about what you do, it's about what people think you're willing to do. That's why fear is so useful. It doesn't require constant effort. Once the image is built, it maintains itself. People start to regulate themselves around you. They speak more carefully, they behave more cautiously. And you didn't have to lift a finger, because the fear did the work for you. But let's be clear, not all fear is the same. There's reckless fear, the kind that burns bridges and creates enemies. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about strategic fear, controlled, measured, designed to protect your power, not destroy your support. Because fear doesn't mean you have to be cruel. It means people believe there are limits, that there's a line they can't cross, that if they do, there will be a cost. And that's what keeps the machine running. In politics, in business, in relationships, in life. Fear is the quiet force behind most forms of power. It doesn't always show its face, but it's there. In the pause before someone speaks, in the silence after someone makes a threat, in the tension that holds people back from doing what they really want to do. And those who understand that, those who learn to use it carefully, hold a different kind of strength. Not the kind that needs to shout, not the kind that begs for loyalty, but the kind that commands it without saying a word. Because in the end, people don't always follow the nicest person. They follow the one they're afraid to betray. Here's a hard truth no one likes to hear. Being moral doesn't protect you from being destroyed. In fact, in the real world, morality, when separated from strength, can become a trap. It gives people the illusion of safety, the illusion of righteousness, while their enemies gather power and sharpen their knives. We're told that doing the right thing should lead to good outcomes. That if you're fair, if you're kind, if you play by the rules, things will work out in your favor. But history tells a different story. The world doesn't reward goodness. It rewards power. And morality, when used without strategy, becomes a mirage. Something that looks solid from a distance, but disappears when you get close. Just look at how many leaders have fallen because they tried to be too good, too trusting, too idealistic. They believed that fairness would protect them, that appealing to people's better nature would stop conflict, that if they showed mercy, others would do the same. But the world doesn't work like that. Not always, because not everyone plays fair. And if you build your power on the idea that they will, you've already lost. Take Rousseau, for example, a philosopher who believed that humans were born good and that society made them corrupt. It's a beautiful idea, hopeful, uplifting, but also completely detached from reality. Machiavelli would have laughed him out of the room, not because he hated hope, but because he understood something deeper. People aren't always driven by goodness. They're driven by fear, by ambition, by self-interest. And pretending otherwise is dangerous. This is why so many moral systems fail in practice, because they ask people to behave better than they really are. And when leaders build their power on that fantasy, on the belief that humans are naturally good, they leave themselves open to betrayal. Worse still, they ignore the fact that moral language is often used as camouflage. People use the word justice to hide revenge. They use the word compassion to gain trust. They use the word peace to delay their enemies until they're ready to strike. The truth is, morality is often just another tool of influence, a weapon dressed in white. Think about it. When a government or institution wants obedience, they don't say, "Do this because we said so." They say, "Do this because it's the right thing to do." They don't talk about power, they talk about principles. But behind those principles is always power. Always. That's why true moral systems, if they want to survive, must be backed by strength. You can't preach goodness without the ability to defend it. If you do, someone stronger will walk in and tear it apart. Not because they hate your morals, but because you made yourself an easy target. The most dangerous thing about moralism is that it convinces people they don't need power. That being right is enough. But being right doesn't stop bullets. Being right doesn't stop invasions. And being right doesn't stop betrayal. Only strength does that. Now, that doesn't mean you should abandon all morality. It doesn't mean you should become cruel or selfish or ruthless just to win. But it does mean that morality has to be paired with power, or it becomes meaningless. You can be kind, but don't be weak. You can be fair, but don't be naive. You can stand for peace, but be ready for war. Because if you don't have the strength to enforce your values, someone else will enforce theirs. And they may not be kind, they may not be fair, and they certainly won't wait for your permission. In the end, the world doesn't bow to the most moral person. It bows to the person who can protect their morality, with force if needed. So don't fall for the illusion. Moralism without strength is just theatre, and weakness, no matter how noble, is still weakness. Weakness doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. And the world hears it like a predator hears the rustle of a wounded animal in the grass. That's the cruel truth. Weakness invites attack. Not because the world is evil, but because it is opportunistic. And in any system where survival is limited by time, resources, or competition, the weak aren't spared, they're consumed. This isn't just about brute strength, it's about signals. We are constantly sending messages through how we speak, how we walk, how we react. And weakness is a message. A message that says, I can be ignored, I can be pushed, I won't fight back. And once that signal is out there, the response is almost always the same. You get challenged, then tested, then replaced. Let's start with a simple, timeless principle. Predators don't attack the strongest. They attack the slowest, the softest, the most uncertain. That's not just true in the wild, it's true in every arena where power is on the line. In politics, in business, in war, and even in love. The perception of weakness, whether it's physical, emotional, or psychological, triggers something ancient in people, something that sees an opening, something that sees a chance to rise at someone else's expense. Look at history. When Rome began to fall, it didn't happen overnight. It rotted from the inside. Its people became comfortable. Its armies became soft. Its leaders lost the edge that had once made Rome feared, and the world noticed. Invaders didn't fear Rome anymore. They sensed weakness. They saw a once powerful empire that now begged for peace instead of preparing for war, and the barbarians didn't hesitate. They took what Rome had left. Or take Weimar Germany, the state that came after World War I. It was democratic, peaceful, and deeply idealistic. But it was also disorganized, politically fragile, and economically weak. And that weakness created a perfect storm. A young, angry political movement saw the opening and stepped in. Not with peace, not with kindness, but with power, certainty, and fear. That's how the Nazis rose. Not in spite of Germany's moral values, but because those values were not backed by strength. They weren't defended with force. They were simply hoped for. And hope without power is a gamble history rarely rewards. But weakness doesn't just collapse empires, it collapses people too. In the modern world, emotional weakness, excessive guilt, constant apology, fear of confrontation is often seen as moral, as humble. But in reality, it's often read as a signal. This person can be manipulated. This person won't fight back. This person is safe to betray. People who cannot set boundaries get used. People who avoid conflict get ignored. And people who think empathy alone will save them often find themselves wondering why no one else plays by the same rules. Even in relationships, whether personal or professional, the power dynamic is always in motion. The moment someone sees you're more afraid of losing them than they are of losing you, you've already lost. It's not that vulnerability is always bad, but vulnerability without strength is a liability. And when it's your default setting, it becomes self-destruction. Think about it this way. When you walk into a room unsure of yourself, others pick up on it, even if no words are spoken. When you're always explaining yourself, always second-guessing, always trying to be liked, people start to believe that you have no edge, no core, no spine. And that's when they stop respecting you. The same thing happens in leadership. A leader who hesitates loses authority. A leader who apologizes for every hard decision becomes a puppet. A leader who refuses to punish betrayal invites more of it, because when there's no cost for weakness, people will test you again and again. Now, weakness doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like comfort. When people get too comfortable, they stop preparing. They lose their sense of danger. They believe they're untouchable, and that's when they're most vulnerable. Comfort breeds softness. Softness breeds exposure. Exposure brings the fall. It's happened to nations. It's happened to CEOs. It's happened to movements, religions, and revolutionary leaders. They rise with fire. They fall with ease. So what does this mean for you? For us? It means that survival, real survival, requires strength. Not just in body, not just in weapons, but in will, in clarity, in the ability to project danger without needing to use it all the time. Because in this world, when people believe you're harmless, they treat you that way. But when people believe you are capable of danger, even if you never use it, they tread carefully. That's not cruelty. That's self-preservation. That's power. Because at the end of the day, the world tests for weakness. It pokes it, pressures it, challenges it. And when it finds it, it doesn't hesitate. It moves in. And so if you want to last, if you want to lead, protect, create, or even just survive, you can't afford to be seen as weak. Not because you want to harm anyone, but because weakness invites harm. It invites disrespect. It invites betrayal. It invites destruction. And no title, no dream, no moral cause can survive if it doesn't know how to fight for itself. So ask yourself, not just, do I believe in something? Ask yourself, do I have the strength to protect it? Because belief without strength is noise, and weakness, whether you see it or not, is the start of your own undoing. So far, we've talked about fear in politics, war, and history. But now, let's bring it closer to home. Because the truth is, you don't need to rule a nation to wield fear. Fear, when used wisely, is a personal form of power. And the strongest people, those who can walk into a room and shift the energy without saying a word, aren't always violent or loud. They're simply feared just enough to be respected. Let's start with a question most people never ask. Are you feared or are you forgettable? Because in life, you're always giving off signals, and people pick up on them fast. When you're too eager to please, people notice. When you avoid conflict at all costs, they notice. And when you constantly explain yourself, doubt yourself, or shrink yourself down to make others comfortable, they definitely notice. They may not say anything, but the calculation begins. How far can I push this person? Will they fight back? Will they challenge me or fold the second it gets uncomfortable? That's why power on the individual level often comes down to presence. Not how much you say, but how you carry yourself. Not how nice you are, but how dangerous people believe you could be if you needed to be. Let's be clear, we're not talking about being violent, rude, or aggressive. We're talking about a quiet strength, a sense of control, an edge. And here's the paradox. The people who are least likely to abuse power are often the ones you don't want to mess with. Because they've developed something rare, discipline, restraint, and the capacity to go dark if pushed. In ancient philosophy, the Stoics understood this well. They didn't fear death. They didn't panic in chaos. They trained their minds to be calm in storms. Why? Because when you master your own fear, you stop being ruled by it. And when you stop being ruled by fear, you start to become the kind of person others are cautious around. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic to his core, commanded an empire not through rage, but through presence. His strength came from within. He didn't need to scream. His calm silence was enough, because real power doesn't always need to perform. It just needs to exist. And that brings us to a critical idea. There's a difference between having fear and being feared. If you're full of fear, people sense it. But if you're in control of your fear, if you faced it, mastered it, and turned it into focus, people sense that too, and they act accordingly. Now let's look at another kind of figure, the charismatic threat. The person who walks in and instantly holds attention. Not because they're styling, not because they're loud, but because people instinctively know this person is not to be underestimated. Think of people like Malcolm X or Steve Jobs, or even James Bond. Fictional, yes, but rooted in something real. These are people who speak with precision, move with intent, and never apologize for taking up space. They project danger, not chaos, but danger that is calm, collected, and entirely under their control. It's not about being feared by everyone, it's about being respected by those who matter. Because respect that's rooted in fear, not terror, but tension, lasts. That brings us to something subtle, but incredibly powerful. Silence. Silence creates mystery. Mystery creates fear, and fear creates control. When you say less, people fill in the gaps. They wonder what you're thinking. They second-guess your reactions. And in that uncertainty, they move more carefully. Strategic silence is one of the oldest forms of power. The samurai practiced it. Warriors used it in battle. Even in business, the person who can sit calmly in silence often ends up controlling the room. And then there's unpredictability, another trait that keeps people alert. When no one can guess exactly how you'll respond, they become cautious. That's not chaos, that's control. And when used wisely, it prevents people from becoming too comfortable around you in the wrong ways. This doesn't mean you need to be cold, distant, or antisocial. It means you need to be clear about one thing. Kindness without boundaries becomes weakness. Warmth without edge becomes softness. And softness, when overexposed, becomes bait. You don't need to be feared by everyone, but you do need to be underestimated by no one. So build your strength quietly. Let your presence do most of the talking. Be generous, but with limits. Be kind, but never at the expense of your self-respect. And most of all, master your fear so no one else can weaponize it against you. Because in a world that tests for weakness at every level, your greatest defense, Biki, is becoming the kind of person people hesitate to challenge. When we say weakness is death, we don't always mean death in the literal sense, but the outcome can feel just as final. Because in the real world, death often wears different faces. It can be the death of your reputation, the death of your influence, the death of your purpose, your identity, or your name. People rarely get taken down in a dramatic blaze. Most are simply forgotten, pushed out, overwritten, replaced. And that kind of death, the slow fade into nothing, is the quiet punishment reserved for those who don't understand how power works. Let's start with a simple truth. The world doesn't always kill you with a sword. Sometimes it kills you with silence. When you lose power, people stop listening. When you lose respect, people stop returning your calls. When you lose your edge, you stop being seen as necessary. And once you're no longer necessary, you're already dead in the eyes of the system. This happens everywhere, from politics to art, from war rooms to boardrooms. Think about the countless leaders, thinkers, revolutionaries, people who once stood at the center of attention, only to vanish when they lost control of the narrative. They weren't killed, they were erased. Because in a world driven by influence, obscurity is death, and weakness, especially public weakness, is often what leads to that fate. Now let's look at some real examples. When Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya, he was seen as dangerous, unpredictable, ruthless. Western nations didn't like him, but they respected the threat he posed. But toward the end, that image cracked. He began to make deals, show softness, and suddenly the people who once feared him stopped. They saw an opening, and in the chaos of the Arab Spring, they took it. Gaddafi didn't die because he was feared. He died because he stopped being feared. He died in a ditch, beaten by a mob. Not just physically, but symbolically stripped of every ounce of power he once had. Or take the case of John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, and idealistic. He wanted peace, He spoke of unity. He was loved. But love didn't save him from the sniper's bullet. Idealism without control invites bold enemies. And bold enemies often don't give warnings. That's the harsh truth. When you don't understand how dangerous the game is, you don't get to play it for long. And sometimes, the death isn't just political or physical, it's cultural. When movements lose their strength, when they get absorbed by the very systems they once challenged, their spirit dies, even if their name lives on. Revolutions become hashtags. Philosophies become marketing slogans. What was once dangerous becomes harmless, hollow, and commercial. That's death, too. But there's another kind of death, one people don't talk about enough: the death of self-respect. This is the quiet collapse that happens inside you when you abandon your edge, when you apologize too much, when you let others decide your worth, when you stop protecting what you believe because you're afraid of conflict. It doesn't show on the outside at first, but over time, it rots your confidence, and once that dies, everything else follows. But there's a flip side to this story, because sometimes death leads to rebirth. Not all endings are final. Sometimes being killed off in one world is what allows you to rise in another. Sometimes losing the old version of yourself is what gives birth to something stronger. The myth of the phoenix is a symbol of that. Burning, dying, and rising again, more powerful, more focused, more dangerous. But to rise that way, you have to face the fire. You have to let go of the weak parts. You have to kill off the softness inside you that keeps letting people walk all over you. And that kind of death? That's not something to fear. That's something to embrace, because in the end, the only death that really matters is the one that leaves you powerless. Whether it comes from betrayal, irrelevance, or surrender, it only comes when you stop defending what matters. So if you want to live, really live, you have to be ready to fight. For your voice, for your space, for your name, because the world doesn't bury people with kindness. It buries people with indifference. And unless you learn how to command fear, or at least respect, you risk fading out long before your time. So far, we've made a strong case for fear, but now we need to pause and ask the harder question: what are the limits of fear? Because yes, fear works. It protects, it controls, it commands. But if that's all you rely on, eventually fear collapses in on itself. The truth is, no form of power lasts forever, especially when it's built on fear alone. History shows us that tyranny is fragile. It looks strong from the outside, but deep down, it's brittle. Why? Because when a leader rules only through fear, the moment that fear slips, the moment people sense weakness or sense a chance to rebel, they explode. And when they do, they don't hold back. We've seen it happen many times. The French Revolution is a perfect example. The monarchy ruled with privilege and distance. There was fear, but no love, no trust. And when that fear cracked, the people didn't just push back, they tore the whole system down. Heads rolled, literally. The same happened with the Soviet Union. Decades of rule through terror and silence. But fear couldn't hold the system together forever. Eventually, the people stopped believing in it. And once belief is gone, even the most intimidating empire can fall apart from within. So yes, fear is powerful, but it's not infinite. People can only be scared for so long. Eventually they adapt, they rebel, or they find someone else to follow, someone who offers them more than fear. And that leads to another truth. Sometimes love really is stronger. Not always, not in every context, but in certain moments, under certain leaders, love, trust, and shared vision created power that didn't need fear to survive. Nelson Mandela led a broken nation, fresh out of apartheid. He could have ruled through vengeance, people expected him to. Instead, he ruled with grace. And people followed, not out of fear, but out of deep respect. That kind of power is rare. But when it happens, It's incredibly strong. The same goes for Gandhi, a man who led a revolution without weapons. He didn't command fear, he commanded moral pressure. He exposed the cruelty of the British Empire not by fighting it head-on, but by making its violence visible and forcing the world to watch. So what does that mean? It means that power through fear works, but it's not the only path. And more importantly, fear must be balanced. Fear without vision becomes cruelty. Fear without respect becomes resentment. Fear without legitimacy becomes rebellion. The real mastery is in knowing when to use fear and when to pull back, when to impose silence, and when to speak with warmth, when to strike, and when to step aside. The strongest leaders, whether they rule nations, companies, or even just their own lives, don't rely on fear alone. They combine it with respect, with clarity, with purpose. Because the goal isn't to live in fear, it's to use fear without being consumed by it. So yes, be someone who commands caution. Be someone others think twice before crossing, but also be someone who knows when fear is enough. Because once fear becomes your only language, no one listens. They just wait for you to fall. Let's not pretend this was a feel-good message. It wasn't meant to be. Fear is power. Weakness is death. That's a dangerous truth. And like most dangerous truths, it makes people uncomfortable. But that doesn't make it any less real. Power is not always held by the kind, the wise, or the good. It is held by those who understand human nature and are willing to act on it. Those who know that fear keeps people in line long after love has faded. That weakness, whether in action or perception, is a signal that predators are always watching for. This isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about becoming aware. It's about waking up from the fantasy that the world is fair, that goodness always wins, that being nice is enough to protect you. It's not. What protects you is strength. What protects you is clarity. What protects you is the ability to command respect without begging for it, and to project danger without ever lifting your voice. You don't have to rule a country to live by this truth. You just have to look around at who gets respected, at who gets ignored, at who walks freely and who walks carefully. This world does not reward weakness. It exploits it. And unless you learn how to embody power, even in silence, you risk being erased. So don't just survive, don't just be liked. Become someone who cannot be overlooked. Because in the end, when all masks are off, the world still runs on one law: fear is power, weakness is death.